Now, the third reason why I'm telling you this story is that chance meeting between these two people changed my life as well. Now, I'm not old enough to have been alive during World War II. And in fact, it would take over 60 years for their story to intersect with me and change my life forever. And I guess at this point, I've got to step back. Now, you can see the backdrop of my library that I'm sitting in. These are all the books that I have, and that's just one wall. And those are mostly all history books. I love reading history. So I'm always looking for interesting books to read. I don't do it as much now during the pandemic, but whenever I had a chance before that to go to a bookstore, I would always go right to the history section and see what new books there might be. And back in 2010, so we're now talking 10 years ago, I wandered into a bookstore in Charlotte, North Carolina, because that's where I was living and working and practicing law at the time. Went to the history section and saw this new book that had just been published. A book called A Lucky Child, written by somebody named Thomas Bergenthal. Now, I'd never seen the book before, I'd never heard of it, I had never read any reviews, I knew nothing about it. But when I saw that cover, and when I saw the subtitle, A Memoir of Surviving Auschwitz as a Young Boy, I thought to myself, this has to be a fascinating human interest story. For anybody to survive in Auschwitz, it's got to be amazing. How a child could possibly have done that has got to be doubly interesting. So I bought the book and took it home. And by the way, that picture of the young boy on the left, that is Tommy. That's taken shortly after he was liberated. That's the summer of 1945. He's all of 11 years old in that picture. Now, by the time that picture's taken, he has spent more than half of his existence on Earth as a prisoner of the Nazis. So you can see that happy-go-lucky child from that first picture is a lot different than this much wiser boy with the 1,000-yard stare in this picture. When I took this book home, I started reading it. I learned the story that I just related to you. How Tommy ends up in Auschwitz, how he takes part in the evacuation, how he arrives in Sachsenhausen with frostbitten feet, how he has some of his toes amputated by a Norwegian doctor named Sven Oftedal, and how while he's lying there, one day he meets up with Nansen. And from that day, Nansen befriends him. From that day forward, Nansen tries to save his life. And when he gets to that part in his memoir, Bergenthal says, by the way, this fellow Nansen who saved my life kept a diary. And then he adds this one footnote on the bottom of page 177, which is a description of the diary. Of course, it was, since Nansen's Norwegian, it first came out in Norway in 3 volumes, then translated into English and German in 1949. So when I saw this footnote, and of course, being trained as an attorney, I cannot let a footnote go by without reading it. I looked at this and I thought, well, I've never heard of this fellow Nansen. I know nothing about Norway's experience in World War II, but maybe it's interesting. When you've got as many books as I have, the bar to purchase another book is pretty darn low. I mean, anything that looks remotely interesting, I'm probably going to check it out. So I based on this information that it came out in 1949, I realized that I'm not going to find it in a bookstore unless I go to some used bookstore and roust around maybe. But of course, in today's world, if we're trying to find something that's unique, hard to find, where do we go? We go to the internet. Everybody who's selling anything in the world is selling it on the internet. So in 2010, I do a search for this book. And I'm surprised to learn that at least in 2010, there was one single copy of this book for sale in the entire United States. One single copy. It was a bookseller, a Norwegian themed bookseller in the state of Washington outside of Seattle. Now I could find 2 more copies available for sale in Great Britain, 1 in Australia, 1 in New Zealand. 5 in the entire world. I mean, I think there's more copies of Gutenberg's Bible for sale on the internet than there were copies of this book. Where all those old copies had disappeared to, Lord only knows. I'm sure they're still in some library somewhere in some people's attics, but they weren't for sale at the time. So I bought one of those books. I bought it actually from the bookseller in New Zealand because it was advertised or described in the best condition. I wanted to have a good copy. And that meant it was going to be weeks and weeks and weeks before it got to me. In fact, it was coming by surface mail from New Zealand. By the time it ended up in my book, in my mailbox, I practically forgot that I ever ordered it in the first place. I was already onto another big history tome, one of these books about the American Revolution or something. And when it showed up, and I opened up the package, and here's what the old book looked like. You can see it's a pretty hefty volume. And I thought to myself, well, I'm already in the middle of a book, which I don't want to stop reading, but I'm also curious to find out about this book, which I know almost nothing about. And since it is a diary, the one advantage of it is it's broken up into hundreds, literally hundreds of little chapters, every diary entry. And so I thought, well, I'll start reading one diary entry every night before I pick up the other book that I'm reading. I mean, that'll take me, what, 3 minutes, 4 minutes to do that? So I did that for about a week. And then one night I got into bed and started reading, because that's when I was still working full time at that point. So I did most of my reading just before I turned in for the night. And I thought to myself, this fellow was in prison for 3.5 years. At the rate I'm reading this thing, it's going to take me 3.5 years to finish it. It's going to be the longest book I've ever read in my life. So why don't I just simply just cut that time in half by starting to read 2 diary entries? And that's what I did. I did that for another week. Then one night I read 2 diary entries, and something was about to happen. I honestly don't remember exactly what it was. Either Nansen was about to get in trouble, he had gotten caught doing something, or his wife was going to come visit him. I forget what it was. But I thought to myself, well, I've got to read the next diary entry to see what happens. So I thought I gave myself permission to start reading 3 diary entries. And I think you can see the slippery slope that I was rapidly sliding down. I got to the point where I put the other book away completely. I don't think I've ever gone back to the history book. And I was completely smitten by this book. Couldn't put it down. I carried it around the house with me. I carried it everywhere I went. I would even go into my law office, and I'd say to my secretary in the morning, listen, Linda, I've got a really important project that I'm working on this morning. I need total concentration. So don't interrupt me. Hold my calls. I don't want any visitors. When I close this door, I want to be left alone so I can concentrate. Of course, what I was doing, I was taking from day to day out of my briefcase and reading it. And before I had even finished reading this book, the thought kept occurring and recurring to me is, how can it be that this book, which has captured me in a way that very few books have, and I consider myself a somewhat discriminating reader because when I have read literally thousands of history books, how can it be that no one else has seen fit to reprint this book and bring it back into circulation for over 60 years? That's practically a lifetime. And again, I don't know the answer to that question. But if you think about it, if there's only 5 books for sale in the entire world in the year 2010, the chances of anybody actually knowing about the book, finding it or stumbling upon it, reading it and doing something about it is pretty darn small. With my one purchase, I've already cornered 20% of the whole market. Now there's only 4 copies available for sale on the internet. So I decided, by gosh, I'm going to get this book back into print. I really have no idea how one does that. I was just a simple real estate attorney. But I just thought I cannot go through life telling people about this magnificent book, which nobody can read because there's no copies to circulate. And so after making lots of mistakes and going down blind alleys and rabbit holes, I finally was able to get this published. In fact, it all came about after a talk that I gave to the Sons of Norway in Nashville, Tennessee. They're called the Music City Vikings. And I gave a talk there, and afterwards, I would always end my talks at those times by saying, I'm trying to find a publisher. I've got a couple of prospects. I'm pursuing a couple of leads. Nothing definite yet, but when it happens, I'll certainly get back to you folks and let you know that the book is available. And after that talk, a gentleman walked up. He introduced himself to me. He says, my name is Sten Vermund, and I'd love to help you. After all, my grandfather was in the same concentration camp as Odd Nansen. And I'm a personal friend of the director of the Vanderbilt University Press. And that was the one opening I needed to talk to somebody, and kind of the rest, as I say, is history. The book came out in 2016 in a fully annotated version. What I did, as I was trying to find a publisher, I decided rather than just take, again, this old copy, give it to a typist and say, create a document, create this whole document all over again as a digital document so it can be circulated, I decided I now have the benefit of 60 years of hindsight, and I've got the power of the internet behind me. I can literally track down everything that happened to almost every single person that Nansen talks about in this diary. I can find out if they survived and what they did after the war. I can research every rumor that he's talking about. I can look up every place that he visits as a prisoner. And so I've added an introduction, a fairly lengthy introduction, and I've also added annotations. For example, Nansen is at a roll call one day and he strikes up a conversation with a young resistance fighter. The man's name is Einar Gerhardsen. Some of you may know that Einar Gerhardsen became the longest serving prime minister of Norway after the war. Nansen was a very good friend with a painter named Per Krogh. Per Krogh was a very famous painter. In fact, he painted the mural that's in the United Nations Security Council chamber in New York City. So this is all the information that I've since added to this book. If you're not interested in reading my annotations, that's fine with me. Reading the diary is the most important thing. I've just tried to create a helping aid for people who want to learn a little bit more about this.